This one's very exciting. We don't always, this is often an overlooked facet of the cannabis industry. Due diligence is very important. You have to do your research. You have to know your facts. You have to have a plan in place, right? So we're gonna bring up our moderator. She's the managing director of FTI Consulting. Right? They work on cyber threats. They work on how to be in compliance with the anti-money laundering laws, right? All the fraud, all your supply chain issues, all your due diligence. They work on that. You can work with them. I'm going to introduce her right now. Let's hear it for the one and only Elaine Carey. Thank you. This microphone. You can use that one. Yeah. You can use that one as well if you prefer.
I don't think this one's working.
It's not? Here, use this one.
I'll trade. Good morning. Thank you for your attention or for joining us today. So I know people sort of their eyes can glaze over when you talk about due diligence and compliance. They're like, oh no, not more of those things we have to do. But I'd like to, and I think my panelists will join me in saying that it has a different, you can look at it in a different way, i.e. to protect your bottom line, to make your business stronger, to make it more viable, and also in the future, if you do want to, when it becomes legal federally, if you want to cash in on that, these are the things you have to do. But you have to do it just now, just to make your business survive, stand out from all the rest. As I always say to people, I have an investigative background. If somebody else's business is softer, they're cutting corners places, that's where the regulators, the authorities are going to go, and the bad guys as well, to infiltrate, because it's easier. If you've crossed all your T's, dotted all your I's, you're a much safer, much healthier business. And that's what we're here to talk about today, which is the financial, operational, regulatory, and reputational risks that you need to guard against. And it doesn't have to be heavy lifting or really, really expensive. I do this for clients. I do due diligence backgrounds on the clients to give to investors or vice versa. I've done anti-money laundering reviews for financial institutions that want to bank cannabis money. Thank goodness they're willing to begin to talk about it. I've done it for armored car companies that want to bank. So there is interest out there, but you've got to do it the right way. And I think we've brought together a pretty interesting panel that covers the entirety of those risks. We start with Bernard next to me. Bernard is from Emerge Law Group here in Portland, and they're the very first law group to get into the business and have deep experience in a variety of issues that you face, from land use to corporate structures to tax, to employment, to HR, and probably things I've forgotten that Bernard will tell you about. And next to Bernard is my colleague Lincoln Eckhardt, who is evaluations and appraisal expert. And one of the things I like about Lincoln is he's also a native to Portland. But very early on, we started doing cannabis services at FTI, which is a little unusual because we are a publicly traded company. We called up Lincoln and said, can you value a cannabis company even though it's kind of a startup and they don't have a lot of formal processes and procedures, and maybe their books are in crayon, I don't know, or on maybe an Excel spreadsheet? And he goes, oh, sure, done it before. So these are the kind of people that you need to, what we want to do today is give you some concrete takeaways. And the last panelist member, Matt Murphy, is Vice President from Khiron Life Sciences. And Matt brings two unique attributes to our panel today. One, he's actually running a cannabis company that's based in Canada but doing work in Colombia, as in Bogota, Colombia. And two, Matt is a retired DEA agent who was on the diversion side and worked in pharmaceuticals for more than 25 years. And I think it's particularly helpful to have Matt today after the DEA moved CBD from Schedule 1 to Schedule 5 the other day. So I think hopefully he can provide some unique insight into how that happened. So let's start with you, Bernard. What are some concrete things that companies need to do in terms of being in compliance with the law, but that aren't going to just sink the ship at the very beginning by getting, if you might say, expensive legal advice, but that helps them grow and prosper.
Sure, thank you. So expensive legal advice is a tough target to hit sometimes, but in terms of being able to cover your bases on the front end without sinking the ship, as Elaine says, I think the kind of the most productive the most productive approach is to identify the categories of issues that you're dealing with. So at Emerge, there's Emerge Law Group, the firm I am with. There are a number of corporate lawyers with deep securities law background. And so if you're starting a company and you're looking at raising money from outside investors, it makes sense to be meeting with someone like that, even if you're not yet ready to, form a corporation or what have you. And that way you're getting off on the right foot. Another area that matters is obviously the licensing end. And right now in the licensing environment in Oregon, you're often talking about going through a process that can take many months, and there are there might be twists and turns along the way as the industry and the regulatory environment continues to develop, and you're not going to want to lose time because you kind of went down what seems to be a wrong track in retrospect. There are also a number of areas that at least a cannabis business person that is relatively new to what we used to call kind of above ground business practices, it can make a lot of sense to be meeting with an employment lawyer to figure out what steps you need to take now so that you're not dealing with a potentially expensive problem maybe just a few months down the road. And then of course there are land use and local code and zoning issues. And then there's my area, which is tax issues. And that's an area where I guess tax professionals often kind of privately gripe about always being brought into transactions late. The reason for that is oftentimes you're brought into a transaction and then you kind of have an only if moment. Only if we had been having this conversation 3 months or 6 months ago, we could be talking about a much smaller tax bill. But in terms of the discussion you'd be having with a tax person on the front end, you'd be talking about, well, what sort of business entity are we going to use? Are we going to be using more than one business entity? When we're trying to pencil out our financials, what is this tax code section 280E issue, and how does that really work? And then and you might end up setting up a very small business that in your context makes sense from a tax perspective, or you might be setting up a multi-entity structure with kind of specific goals in mind. Maybe protecting risk-averse investors from potentially adverse or expensive tax consequences flowing through to their personal returns. Or you might be looking at ways to allow your business to have access to the kind of expertise it needs without the compensation you're paying those people being non-deductible because of 280E. Or you might be looking at ways to ensure that when you renew your lease, for example, that you don't You don't end up losing, you know, a $300,000 tax deduction just because you didn't plan ahead in how you set up your lease. So if you're sitting down with an attorney or different specialist attorneys, as you kind of learn the lay of the land, if you're sitting down with them at kind of a brainstorming, a planning level, and then you get together with your team after you've, I guess, educated yourself somewhat in that environment, then I think you're going to find that not only are taxes it'll be a much less expensive proposition, but you're also going to be able to manage those taxes in real time and not get behind the ball. And then getting to the due diligence portion of things, you're not going to be having a potentially awkward conversation with an investor or a potential buyer down the road who comes from a world where tax compliance is taken for granted and is just expected, and who might start to wonder what other problems you have simply because you have some unaddressed tax issues.
Thanks, Bernard. Lincoln, we've seen all these mega valuations coming out of Canada that could make anybody's eyes get stuck with dollar signs in them because it just looks so wonderful, but at the same time maybe fantastical. One of the things you'd said to me is value is all about pricing risk. Can you explain what you mean about that and what you think about these sort of, if you will, sky-high valuations going around, and is that going to stay there forever?
Yeah, thanks, Elaine. I think it's important to bifurcate the public market from the private market. I think in Canada you have seen some sky-high valuations applied to cannabis businesses. I think there's a couple of reasons for that. One, it's Canada. It's a different regulatory structure, obviously. Two, the company's gone public. When a company goes public, it's really been de-risked by a large magnitude. And there's also a lot of hot money that's moving into that sector. So it's not atypical to see, some of these cannabis companies in Canada publicly traded that are trading at 100, 200, 400 times revenue. When you come back to the private sector and you look at what's happening in transactions in the private sector, you see much more pedestrian multiples. I'd say there was a recent transaction in Washington State of 6 large retail operations. It's sold at 1 times revenue or 0.7 times next 12 months revenue. It's a far cry from a 400 times revenue. I think a big part of that is really what I want to hit on in terms of the due diligence considerations, which is valuation essentially is a pricing risk exercise. I mean, you're basically pricing risk. Value equals the present value of future expected cash flows. Not the sexiest thing in the world, but that's how you value a business or any asset. You look at, what are the expected future cash flows, and you present value those cash flows back to present, to today. That present valuing exercise is that you use a risk-adjusted discount rate. So you kind of build up a discount rate based on the risks that you see in the asset or in the business. With cannabis companies, one of the challenges are there's already sort of systematic risks that are there, essentially because of the regulatory environment, because of public perception, because of other factors. You already have a risk premium built in when looking at cannabis companies. I think to the benefit of owners, or anyone who's operating a business in the cannabis industry, the most critical thing you can do is try to de-risk when you're thinking about a potential exit down the road or trying to raise capital from outside investors. Whatever you can do to de-risk the enterprise, it's a direct correlation between de-risking an enterprise and increasing the value. They're inversely related, right? So if you have systems in place, processes in place, if you have cash management systems, seed to sale systems in place, you have contracts with your suppliers, with your wholesalers or retailers, whatever aspect of the industry you're in. If those contracts have been, vetted by lawyers or written by lawyers, and they've been validated. Your financial systems, your accounting systems, all these things that sometimes seem sort of mundane and not of great interest, especially when you're trying to build a business. You're focused on your customers, you're focused on your product or whatever it is, the service that you're providing. You're not necessarily too concerned or thinking about the more mundane aspects of the business. Well, when you go to a point of trying to raise capital or get a value assigned to this asset that you're building, that you own, it's all about that de-risking process. That an outside investor can come in and look at your business and say, okay, everything checks out. I don't see any red flags here. That process and that creating that system in place, that enterprise, will directly pay off in terms of increased value. As Elaine said, we first started talking about valuing cannabis companies, and she had said a client, what happens if they just have some spreadsheets and all their financials are basically just a couple of Excel data sheets, and that's all they really have as documents to look at with this business. Yeah, you can certainly value it, but the risk premium you're going to apply when you're present valuing those cash flows, or whether you're using a market multiple, is directly correlated to the quality of the information. Another really important point is people. Right? I mean, you can have great financials, at least financial statements. You can have these systems in place. You can have these checks and balances built into your operations to make sure that you've minimized risk. But really, what an appraiser or what an investor is going to look at is the quality of management. I don't care what industry you're in, that's probably the single most important thing. So as you look to build or expand or partner with other companies, or you bring in outside people to help build your business, just as Elaine alluded to earlier, something that she does due diligence on people, due diligence on your suppliers, your wholesalers, whoever you're in your chain of operations. Just make sure you put forth the effort to really research who it is that you're working with, because that's something that's going to be very important to a potential investor. And as I said, everything you can do to have a low risk, well documented, well insulated infrastructure will behoove you when you go to raise capital or sell, because it's going to have a direct impact on what you basically can achieve in the marketplace for your asset.
Showing you how devastating it can be if you don't know who the people are you're involved with, your partners, other management, et cetera. We had a case recently where I was doing an anti-money laundering review at a credit union in California that was going to bank cannabis, and we were talking about whether or not they had actually terminated any clients recently. And they said yes, they had 2 gentlemen come in. There was a partnership of 3 people. 2 people had come in recently, and they said they were completely just ashen-faced, and they were just so downtrodden. And they said, we had to come in and tell you personally that we just found out our 3rd partner had been sanctioned by the SEC. And they knew exactly what was going to happen, which was their account. They were one of the few people that was lucky enough to actually have an account in a bank, and the account was, they realized what was going to happen. The account was closed, and they were back to zero, all because even though they were partners in a business, they hadn't looked closely enough at each other to figure out what their prior histories had been and whether or not that was going to impact the business, and boy, did it. So turning to you, Matt, you're the one person who has very hands-on experience. Can you and I also know that you're very familiar with a lot of these systems, because you and I have talked about seed to sales tracking systems, which ones are good, how important that is. Can you talk to us a little bit about the concrete steps that you tell people to take and that Khiron has taken to protect the company? And then I guess the other 2 points I'd like you to make are one about diversion, because obviously that was your history at the DEA. You were a diversion expert, and how you help people deal with that in their cannabis business. And of course, we need to hear from you on the whole Schedule 1 to Schedule 5 for CBD. That's a whole mouthful for you to take on.
I think I can handle it. So to talk a little bit about my background, as Elaine mentioned, I spent over 25 years as a special agent with the Drug Enforcement Administration, and I'll just answer the question you're all thinking, because I get it all the time. So how did you end up a DEA agent in this space. It's really been a pretty seamless and easy transition for me because part of my job responsibilities back in the day, if you will, was when was at the beginning of the opioid epidemic. I was on the front lines of shutting down first internet pharmacies where people could go online and order a prescription drug by Googling hydrocodone without a prescription. Websites would come up, they would order Vicodin, and they basically filled out an online questionnaire that would be sent to some doctor who could be sitting on a boat in the Bahamas, who would just hit click, click, yeah, approve. And what happened was that would be sent to an online pharmacy. Most of them were in Florida that would just fill prescriptions and send them out FedEx, UPS, all over the country. And the Ryan-Haight Act was passed that mandated a face-to-face doctor-patient visit before a prescription for an opiate could be issued. So the reason I bring that up is because that was the early stages of the opioid epidemic. I was at headquarters at the time and worked with a guy named Joe Ranzizi. 60 Minutes did a big report about that because of things that happened that shouldn't happen. But when pain clinics or internet pharmacies were outlawed, pain clinics became the norm because they had a doctor on site. And then this issue just got worse and worse and worse. So when 60 Minutes did their piece, I was interviewed as well and was on camera. What's happened over the years is I've determined and believe, which I've heard much talk of here today, which I'm happy to hear, that I believe, and many others do as well, that medical cannabis can be an alternative to opioids. Everybody in this country, I'm sure everybody in this room knows somebody who's been touched by the opioid epidemic, whether it's a friend of your child, or friends of yours. We all know somebody. Opioids, and I was on the, again, I've been there. Opioids, as far as I'm concerned, are bad drugs, and they're dangerous and they're addictive, and people die. So, with that, medical cannabis, I believe, is a good alternative. I've written articles about it. As far as my work with Khiron, I was approached by another agent that I worked with. Khiron's a company that is the first seed-to-sale medical cannabis company to be operating in Colombia. And Colombia legalized medical cannabis about a year ago. So I was recruited by Khiron to come in and stand up their compliance and regulatory division. And what I've done is brought basically DEA's rules and regulations as it pertains to regulating the pharma industry for controlled substances to the cannabis space. The reason I think that's important for the folks in this room is because, as Elaine mentioned yesterday, I'm sure many of you know, maybe some of you don't, DEA rescheduled CBD oil from a Schedule 1 to a Schedule 5 controlled substance, which means that the Code of Federal Regulations that are enforced by DEA as it pertains to controlled substances will now be applied to CBD oil. And I think, and I've thought for a long time, that that is just basically the start of prohibition ending. Is CBD oil, which has a very low THC, obviously, if any THC content at all. So FDA has already done so as far as descheduled. So I think that this is how this prohibition ending will evolve from CBD oil to then medical cannabis, and we'll see where it goes from there. So when that happens, I think the DEA will take over regulatory for the industry at some point. I mean, that could be a big leap for me to say, but I do believe that the same regulations that are applied now to controlled substances for pharma companies will be applied to the cannabis space. The good thing about that is it'll bring consistent regulation to the cannabis industry. So instead of in Oregon, where maybe it's the Alcohol Commission, those folks that were here earlier, and other states where you have it's the health, the Department of Health, or whoever it is that regulates the industry in every state, it's regulated a little bit differently. And as the industry evolves and the government evolves and prohibition ends, you'll see consistent regulation, I think, throughout the industry, which I think will be a really good thing. And as the folks mentioned on the panels prior, that, saving the industry, it sounds like saving the industry in this state means that you need to be able to export to other states and maybe other countries. And obviously, consistent regulation and prohibition ending is going to bring that a long way. As far as the due diligence, we apply the due diligence standards that are in the CFR to our regulations in Khiron. Seed to sale in technology that can advance and monitor seed to sale is very important. Serialization technology, very important. There are software companies out there that you may, I'm not sure if in Oregon, if you're mandated to use one company for reporting to the state, if that, is that the case here? Which company do you use? Metric, okay. So some states use BioTrack THC, which is a company that we're familiar with. And I think a lot of that has to do with both compliance to prevent, detect diversion, but it's also, I think, for tax purposes, for reporting, so that they can tax the growers and whatnot. But operating in Colombia is a very unique and creates circumstances very specific to the region. But I think that the same methodology can be applied anywhere. I mean, we're starting a company from scratch, building a grow operation on the equator, and again, because of Colombia being a narco state in the past, with people like Pablo Escobar and kingpins and cartels, it presents a very unique set of challenges for us that you may not have here in the United States, of course, because we're a different society. But when you drill down into what it takes to operate a successful regulated industry, the same challenges apply in Colombia or anywhere in Latin America, South America, that apply here in the U.S. So it's, as Elaine mentioned and my colleagues mentioned here, it's about the due diligence is about knowing your customer, knowing your suppliers, knowing your vendors, doing that due diligence on those folks to ensure that they're not involved in activity that may bring adverse action against your license. And that's very important to know the people that you're in business with, because that can lead to big problems for you in your operation. And as another gentleman on a panel previously said, asking for forgiveness is not an option. So it's important, whether it's your seed to sale technology or it's knowing your vendors and suppliers, that everybody is well vetted, and you're doing business with people who are legitimate, as opposed to gray market or black market folks. So, did I cover?
I think you got there. Yeah. Bernard, what would you say was the biggest legal mistake people make in terms of getting their cannabis businesses going? I've seen indications now that litigation is beginning, where partners may have started off with a handshake, and then as the business grows, they begin to fight, and then there's no contract or no corporate bylaws, et cetera. What are you seeing that begins to trip up companies and cause them the most grief?
That would actually be an interesting question to poll lawyers working with the industry. In my case, and I think with a number of the attorneys I work more closely with, that kind of failure to formalize what are, in essence, legal relationships is very high on the list. I think oftentimes there's a reluctance to go down the path of, I guess, reviewing all the ways you maintain a business relationship with someone, whether it be a supplier or a service provider or whatever, or quite likely a business partner, and going down that path of identifying those areas where maybe you don't maybe see eye to eye, or maybe one of you wants one thing and the other one wants something else, and so I think there can be both a learning curve as business people become familiar with concepts like formal contracts, but also maybe a reluctance to have some of the, I guess, more pointed discussions that you need to have on the front end. And then, of course, over time, if you don't have a document that you and your business partners, or you and another person or business can refer to figure out what the rules are and what the deal is, then the relationship can start to drift, and just like personal relationships, unless there's a kind of an effort at that point to kind of bring things back in line with an arrangement that works for everyone, then you can have those very expensive issues where, a healthy business is maybe damaged, or maybe needs to be liquidated because some of the key owners aren't getting along. So.
Yeah, I just want to add to that, 'cause that's a really great point, and my practice does a lot of litigation support work. So we do a lot of valuations, economic damages work in the context of litigation. And I'd say one of the number one reasons that you see people in litigation around value of businesses is that the shareholder agreement, or whatever the operating agreement was that was constructed, was poorly written and poorly executed. Every business is either going to be sold or it's going to liquidate at some point. There's not really any other outcome for a business. So putting forth the initial effort in the beginning to really make sure you define terms around value and ownership and what happens upon different exit scenarios, what happens upon an owner's death, what happens upon a shareholder dispute of one type or another is critical. Because I'd say, no exaggeration, 50% of the litigation work I see is due to poor agreements. And there's a falling out between business partners, and then there's a fight because it wasn't clearly spelled out how the shares or how the interest, the units in an LLC, for example, should be valued. And it creates massive headaches, it's super expensive, and so just to your point, making sure those agreements are in place and really well thought out, and terms are defined, like, is it fair market value? Do you have consideration of shareholder discounts, minority level discounts for lack of marketability? All these terms that appraisers use every day, obviously most business people aren't necessarily familiar with them, but just think about that question of value and what happens upon some sort of exit.
Okay, and just because tax is kind of my area, I will, without getting technical, observe that a common result of maybe being slow to address tax issues, maybe in part because we as individuals, we kind of think about tax once or twice a year as April 15th approaches, and then maybe as the extended deadline approaches. If someone's running a business, say for a year or 18 months, dealing with all the complexity and so on and hard work that's involved, if they're not addressing tax issues almost in real time, kind of on a monthly or maybe quarterly basis, which can require maybe being a little bit forceful with one's CPA, who might be used to clients that think about these things once a year. If you don't do that, then the company can maybe just be starting to become established. Maybe some people in the business are starting to feel like they're hitting their stride a bit. And then you get to tax return time, March, April, whatever, and then you suddenly realize you have a $200,000 debt that you didn't know you had before. And maybe you just made a business decision 2 months earlier. Maybe you just entered into a deal based on the idea that you thought you had $200,000 that maybe now you realize you don't have. Or or maybe that kind of issue flows through to a risk-averse investor. So then at that point, you're getting the email or the phone call from the investor after they just had a very tense and uncomfortable discussion with their CPA or maybe their spouse. And that addressing these issues, that type of issue on the front end can be helpful, but it's very common that people aren't able to do that.
Are either of you seeing any intellectual property problems coming up and maybe resulting in litigation? I've seen bits here and there, but I don't know if you've dealt with those yet. They're coming for sure.
Yeah,
People are
they're
gonna fight over
coming.
it.
They're coming. I mean, I haven't dealt specifically with that issue yet, but I've been reading it. You know, obviously it's being discussed, and IP valuations in the cannabis industry are very significant, and there's a lot of these operations or businesses, the value really is in the IP, whether it be a license or trying to a brand, a trademark, any sort of a process. I mean, there are patents being issued, and I think there's going to be litigation coming from claims of patent infringement. But to answer your question, I haven't done anything specifically in that space, but I believe it's coming.
Lincoln, do you have any thoughts on what businesses can do to identify IP that's going to be worth protecting or going to be valuable when they get to a point of potentially selling the business?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, I think if you have, if you're, let's say it's a product or a brand that's getting, that's driving value, I mean, certainly you can always, have someone look at that question for you, and there's certainly IP is valued every day, and you look at a business and you kind of allocate value from the different assets in that business. One of those assets, key categories, is intangibles, which covers patent and IP and other intangibles. But if you believe you have something of value that is not a tangible asset, there's a reason why you're able to generate returns or earnings. It's a good chance it could be in an intangible asset. Having that identified and patented or trademarked, licensed in some way, secures that becomes transferable. That asset now can be transferred to a buyer. Without that sort of recognition or trademark or legal protection, a buyer's not going to pay you anything for it, because there's no guarantee that they'll be able to maintain the value of that asset. So I just, if you think that you have a business that has intangible value and you're thinking about, bringing in outside investors or an exit scenario, it behooves you to have someone help you look at that and quantify that, and then talk about, with an attorney, obviously, how to license it, how to protect it. Because, a lot of businesses, a large percentage of the value is locked up in that intangible value.
Hey, Matt, I know you do some reviews of cannabis businesses for operational and security problems. What sort of things do you find that people overlook in those situations that cause them problems on those two fronts?
Security and record keeping are probably two of the main issues, I think, that can get folks in trouble in regards to compliance and reporting. But depending on whether it's a dispensary, a grow operation, or what your business operation entails, we like to look at cannabis operations is the way you would probably fortify in the U.S. a bank with CCTV coverage, and I'm sure that in Oregon there are certain criteria that are mandated by the state. I know the regulations are onerous, and as far as the CCTV, biometrics for employees is very important. I know somebody mentioned earlier about background investigations on employees and ensuring that they don't have any felony drug arrests is important. Diversion as it pertains to employee theft and loss is very important. We through the technology that's available that we're utilizing in tracking and tracing, from seed to sale, it's important to be able to put your fingers on a plant at any time during the production chain, during the supply chain as it moves through the growth process. So protecting the operation from outside infiltration is obviously very important, as is employee theft and diversion. And I think that, obviously this industry is very, it's a new industry and it's evolving, and credibility and legitimacy are very important as we move forward, so that the folks that are the naysayers out there don't have a leg to stand on in regards to your operation and being legitimate, credible, good neighbors, good in the community that you're working within, is very important, because right now I think there are believers and there are naysayers, just like in anything else. So I think that it behooves everybody to be good corporate citizens and be good neighbors, and to make sure that you have the most robust security and compliance program that you can, both to protect your own license and, of course, to prevent theft, diversion, and loss from occurring as well.
Matt, I know a good number of businesses out there, and some businesses that I'm familiar with have had these issues arise where they discover a diversion issue, or they discover something about a particular employee or business associate. Do you have any thoughts on how best to move forward with those situations when they come to light?
I think, if you have an employee that's stealing, first thing you need to do is terminate that employee, obviously, and depending on the scale of the diversion and the theft, you would want to notify the authorities, regulatory agency. I think that if you and this is how it worked with the farm industry as well, if you determine the diversion's taking place before they do, that's much better than being told by an outside entity that you have a problem within. It's going to be a lot worse for your operation if a regulator finds a problem that you didn't know existed. And that happens in the farm industry all the time. And it's not good when it comes to fines and adverse actions against their DEA registration. So if you have an issue within your operation and you can talk to the regulators and bring it to their attention, say, hey, this is what happened, but we dealt with it, and this person's, we notified local authorities, person's been terminated, and of course being able to determine exactly what that looked like from a theft and loss perspective, reporting it should put you in a good place as far as how you're viewed by that authority, as opposed to them coming in, finding there's something wrong and something missing and things are amiss, and now you have to find out which employee you have a problem with, and then of course you could be dealing with significant issues against your license. And so it's always better to be ahead of that, I would say, and that's about due diligence, about doing audits, about inventories, and hopefully that the software tools that you use will assist you greatly in that undertaking.
I think we've got time for about one more comment. We're running out of time. Go ahead.
Oh, sure. This is sort of a lawyer comment. In a lot of these situations, where people discover employee theft, or really any number of, I guess, anxiety-producing scenarios, which the industry is familiar with, given its history. It can be very important to take a deep breath, I think, in my view, and to meet with your attorney, or at the very least kind of have an internal sit down within an organization and discussion, but meet with an attorney and kind of talk through what's going on and the potential implications start to figure out how to address it in kind of a methodical way. The reason I say that is because so often it seems like these situations arise, and then because a company or an individual takes sort of an iterative approach, maybe having a discussion amongst the people in the company other than the person that is a bad actor, and then maybe only later then having a discussion with them and then being undecided as to whether there's a way to remove that person from the company. Because of these kind of iterative approaches, and maybe even a little bit too much of a focus on what are the authorities going to do when they find out. Because of that, you can end up with a scenario where it looks worse than it is, or it looks like maybe more people in the company were involved in the bad acts than really it should and really it needs to.
All right.
I think with that, we're going to have to wrap it up.
Can we have one question? Can we have one
Sure.
question, and then we'll wrap it up? Thank you.
Absolutely.
Let's hear it again for the whole panel, everybody.
My name is Roberta Robles. I'm from Oregon. I do transportation policy and audit work. And what we found in the state of Oregon after the Columbia River crossing debacle, when we dropped the ball on building a new bridge to Washington, because their data modeling systems were inaccurate. So I want to ask you guys to put on your risk audit policy hats and look at the cannabis systems at the OLCC, and are there going to be any hidden skeletons in data accuracy, data transitions for how we manage those data systems? Because right now we could be exporting our knowledge. We can't export flower, but we can export our knowledge. And so I'm really concerned about the state of Oregon's ability to manage these databases.
Well, we do have experts that are data analytic experts that look at that sort of thing and figure out where data is going and what you've got there, but it's a very technical question and probably not one we can answer fully at this point.
One of my colleagues from Emerge is here that might be able to speak to some specific issues there. So I'd be happy to introduce you.
Great, thank you. Let's hear it again for Elaine
you.
Carey and the rest of the panel. That's FTI Consulting. I'm sure they'd be happy to talk with you more outside the halls. And once again, let's hear it for Anthony!